Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read an abridged version of Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen, 8th edition, published in 1898. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, at gmail.com. Before we begin, a small content note and a warning. Please be aware that the early sections of this book include occasional descriptions of pet deaths, some by misadventure or accident. If you prefer to avoid those, please rejoin us at episode 13. This book was written quite some time ago, and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks, language choices, and husbandry practices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you rather than for educational purposes. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Titmice. I must own my strong liking for these active, saucy little birds. For 18 years I have always had a basket hung just outside the dining room window containing their favorite food, i.e. fat of any kind, cooked or uncooked, and most amusing it is to watch their little odd ways and tempers whilst frequenting the said basket. 4 species thus studied showed distinct characteristics. Directly I put out a fresh supply of fat, the coal tit would spend all his time and energies in carrying it away, piece by piece, to lay by in store for the future, in crevices in the bark of trees, and this work he would carry on with misplaced energy until the basket was emptied. The greater tit and marsh tit came quietly for the supply of their own personal needs, and to feed their young in nesting time, but the blue tit was by far the most amusing. His attitudes were quite a study. He seemed rather to prefer being upside down. Clinging to the basket and hammering away at the hard fat, head downwards, was a favorite pose. Then, when anyone else desired a share, he would make a stand with open beak and outspread wings and enact king of the castle in the most impertinent manner, considering his tiny dimensions. A guerrilla warfare seems always going on amongst these blue tits. If one was in the basket and remaining perfectly still, I knew 2 or 3 others were meditating a sudden combined assault, but it seemed as if the steady gaze of the titmouse in possession kept them at bay for a time. At length a twittering scrimmage ensued, and the combatants disappeared. I once coaxed a blue tit to live in the dining room for a few days, and he made himself very happy, constantly flitting about in search of insects, running up and down the curtains like a veritable mouse, alighting on any joint of cold meat which happened to be on the sideboard, and making an excellent dinner in Bohemian fashion. Of course, his fearless curiosity led him into difficulties. He would sit on the edge of a jug and peer down to see what it might contain, and his plumage was not improved by the baths of milk or cocoa which he met with in pursuit of knowledge of this kind. Some years ago, an empty cocoa husk with a hole at one end, furnished with nesting materials, was hung up just above the basket of fat. A large tit began to build in it, but unhappily for him, a blue tit had also been house hunting and determined to settle in it. I saw the matter decided by a pitched battle between the two. They fought desperately, rolling over and over on the lawn, pecking, chirping, beating each other with their wings like little feathered furies as they were. At last it was ended, and Blue Tit was victor. It was pretty to see the tiny pair building their nest, with little happy twitterings and confabulations over each piece of moss or dried leaf, and so fearless were they that a large blind was often let down close to and over the husk without disturbing the inmates. When the hen bird was sitting, the cock would bring a green caterpillar for her every 4 or 5 minutes, and sometimes take her place on the nest. I often took the husk down from its nail to show the brave little bird sitting on her eggs. If touched, she would hiss and set up her feathers, but did not leave her nest. When the young birds were hatched, the parents were incessantly at work from early morning till late at night, bringing small caterpillars about every 2 minutes to supply the wants of the tiny brood. One can judge of the usefulness of these birds in ridding our gardens of insect pests by the amount consumed by this one pair. By a moderate calculation, and judging by what I saw one afternoon, I believe they must have brought 3,570 in the course of 1 week. At last the day came when 5 little blue heads peeped out of the entrance to the husk. One after another, the little ones flew into branches nearby. The last one I held in my hand for a while that I might draw its portrait. Fearing it might be hungry if I kept it too long, I placed it in a cage on the lawn, where the old birds found it and fed it for me through the bars. I then brought it in again, and having finished its likeness, had the pleasure of restoring it to its parents. The blue and coal tit often choose the inside of a disused pump as their nesting place. A coal tit built in an old pump in our grounds for many years, the curved spout being its mode of ingress and egress. I could open a small door and look at the pretty little hen on her nest, and then at her numerous family, and watch their growth till old enough to fly. Certainly young birds show a grand lesson of obedience, for creeping out into the world through a dark, curved pipe must have seemed a rather perilous mode of exit. Another less fortunate coal tit built in a post box placed by a garden gate, and seemed in no way disconcerted when letters came in suddenly around and upon her. She usually laid 18 eggs in a deep, soft nest of moss and hair. As boys were apt to take this nest year after year, a lock was placed to the box to protect the little bird. For several years, a blue tit chose to build her nest in the lower part of a stone vase in the garden. There was a hole for drainage in the bottom, and through this hole the little bird found a circular space just suited for her nest. That particular vase could not be filled with plants till long after all the rest were gay with flowers. We were obliged to wait till the domestic affairs of the tit family were ended, else their fate would have been sad indeed. There is no doubt that these birds do contrive to secure their share of peas and other things in the kitchen garden, and are by no means favorites with the gardeners, but I still maintain that the good they do in destroying insects counterbalances their evil doings in other respects. However, they sometimes commit other misdemeanors. My head gardener came to me one day looking very serious, and began by asking what he was to do about those blue tits. "Why, what have they been doing?" I asked. "Two of them have been sitting at the entrance of one of the hives, and they picked off and killed every bee as it came out, and now they've begun upon a second hive." "Well, you had better hang up some potatoes stuck over with feathers, and that will frighten them away." "I've done that, ma'am, and they sit on the potatoes and look at me." It was a trying case of utter contumacy, and at last I was obliged, for the sake of saving my bees, to let one little victim be shot and hung up as an awful example to the rest, and it proved an effectual remedy. My basket of fat used to prove very attractive all through the cold weather when, I suppose, these tiny birds need the caloric it supplies. They always left off coming as soon as the days were warm and insects plentiful. Zoe, the nuthatch. A visit to a bird dealer's shop always awakens a deep feeling of pity in my mind as I looked at the unhappy, flutter little captives, and think of the breezy hillsides and pleasant lanes from which they came to be shut up in cages a few inches square, with but little light, a stifling atmosphere, strange diet, and no means of washing their ruffled feathers or stretching their wings in flight. Truly they are in evil case, and no wonder so many die off within a few days of their capture. In some places they are better cared for than in others, but in most bird shops dirt and misery seem to prevail amongst the tenants of the cages. One such place I have often visited for the sake of meeting with live curios. The owner was a kind-hearted woman and did not intentionally ill-treat her livestock, but the shop was very dark and dirty, and one could but wonder how anything contrived to live in such close, stivey air. On going in one day, I nearly walked over a large, pensive-looking duckling which stood in the middle of the shop. He had a strange, old-fashioned look, and gave one the impression that he was already tired of life and felt bored. A lark, on its little piece of turf, fluttering and looking up for a glimpse of blue sky, a dejected robin with no tail to speak of, and sundry other sad-looking specimens met my pitying gaze, and I suppose I had caught their sorrowful expression, for I was startled by a sharp voice near me saying, "What's the matter?" I turned to reply and found the inquiry was made by a gray parrot, who introduced himself as Pretty Paul, and was ready to make friends to any extent. But my attention had been caught by seeing what looked like a nuthatch, only it was moping and ill, with eyes shut and feathers ruffled. I asked about it, and was told it had some injury to its foot, and was unsaleable, as the woman feared it would not live. I made a bid for it, and was accepted. I confess I was not sorry to leave the stilling air of the shop and bring my new pet home. I fitted up a large cage with pieces of wood and tree bark, a pan for bathing, sand and fine gravel, a bone with a little meat upon it hung from the roof of the cage, and other suitable food was placed in a tin. The poor birdie was a pitiable object for some days. She ate now and then, but remained for the most part quite still, with closed eyes, from morning till night. Then she began to creep up and down the small tree stem I had placed in the cage. She took a bath and plumed herself, and in less than a fortnight she became quite well and vigorous, and very amusing in a variety of ways. Never was there a more active, busy little creature. Her characteristic was life, so she was named Zoe. And before long she seemed to recognize her name and would give an answering chirp. The pieces of bark appeared to afford a never-failing interest. They were examined and investigated in every crevice. Like a little woodpecker hanging head downwards, Zoe would hammer at a nut fixed in the cracks of the bark, and would hide away unfortunate mealworms not required for immediate use. Zoe regularly honeycombed the little tree stem with her incessant hammering, and in the numerous holes thus made she kept her supply of food. No sooner was her tin filled with small pieces of raw meat than she began stowing them all away for future use. She seemed to exercise a good deal of thought about the matter. A morsel would be put in and out of a hole half a dozen times before it was considered settled and suitable, and then it had to be well rammed in and fixed, and off went the busy little creature to fetch another piece, and so on till all was disposed of and the tin left empty. Zoe was greatly exercised by a half-opened Brazil nut. It was too large to fix into the bark. It would not keep steady while she pecked at it, and yet there were good things inside which must be obtained. I watched her various devices with great amusement. She hung head downwards from the tree stem and hammered at it on the ground, but it shifted about and she made no way. Then she carried it in her beak and tried fitting it into various places. I hope she did not swear at it, but she seemed to think the thing was possessed, for it was not like the ordinary nuts. She could manage them. They would go into holes in the bark. This wouldn't fit anywhere, and yet she could not give it up. At last, by a bright inspiration, she got it fixed into a space between the tree stem and the side of the cage. Now she was in high glee, and all the household might have heard the rapping that went on while she scooped out the inside and chipped off pieces to be hidden carefully away in some secret place. Zoe had a cozy nook under a sloping piece of bark, to which she would retire at times, and sitting down on the bottom of her cage in the shadow, looked like a little gray mouse. When appetite brought her out again, she would go to her tree larder and pick out the choice hidden morsels, as if they were the insects which would have been her food if her lot had been cast amongst tree branches instead of in a cage. When winter began, Zoe was placed in the conservatory, where a tame robin often came for a few hours to enjoy his daily crumbs and the pleasant warmth of the air. Bobby was greatly puzzled at the nuthatch, watching her hammerings from the top of the cage, walked round it, surveying the provisions inside, and at last he made up his mind to get in somehow and partake of the longed-for dainties. I could see quite plainly the attraction, the hesitation, the pros and cons, and then, finally, the resolve, and felt very curious as to how the birdish mind would carry out its intention. There was only one place where the bars were rather widely apart, so that the nuthatch could have got out if she had possessed half the wits of the robin. After a quiet survey and a few flights backwards and forwards, Bobby saw this place and made towards it, sat and considered for a few seconds, and finally went in. The nuthatch was sitting quietly under her piece of bark and did not see him, so he picked up the desired morsels and, after a few minutes, went out where it came in. These visits he repeated frequently through the day, but once I was amused to see that he forgot the way out, and put himself in a great fuss, realized that a cage was a prison, and flew up and down in a fright, until by chance he saw the opening and glided out. At last, Zoe caught him in the act of purloining her goodies, and was most indignant. A rush at the thief, with an angry chirp, sent Bobby flying away in ignominious haste, a wiser but not a repentant bird, for he continued his robberies, only with care to avoid being caught. He ventured only a little way into the cage, ready to go out at a moment's notice. Zoe had a good deal of quiet humor, and was a character in her way. She considered me very attentively one day, with a roguish look in her black eyes, and then, going to her tree-stem larder, she pulled out a hidden mealworm and held it up for me to see, with an evident wish that I should know about it, and possibly with a little birdish triumph that she possessed such delights. And then it was put back again and well rammed into its crevice until the hungry moment should arrive. After a few months, Zoe became tame enough to be let out of her cage, and would hop quietly about the room, and, like a small gray-coated detective, would peer about stealthily under tables and chairs in search of live dainties, and extremely pretty she looked as she crept up the curtains with jerky motions, evidently thinking they were tree stems where, by careful search, delightful centipedes and beetles might be found. I do not know if naturalists have remarked that the nuthatch has a very limited range of vision. Zoe could see nothing beyond 12 or 14 inches. The most tempting mealworm might lie on the floor of the cage unnoticed if she happened to be on her tree stem. And I have tried bringing the insect nearer by degrees, and found that only when within a foot of her eyes could she see it, and I fancy then only indistinctly, as she would peer about excitedly, as if uncertain what it was, until near enough to be in the focus of clear vision, and then by a sudden dart she would seize and flit away with it. At first, Zoe's roosting place was under the curved piece of bark lying on the floor of her cage, but after a time she took up her nightly quarters in a small box which hooked on to the side of her cage. It was a very cramped and uncomfortable lodging, and I wondered how she contrived to squeeze into such a small space. It occurred to me that a little coconut with a hole at one end would be the sort of sleeping chamber she would prefer, as being most like a hole in a tree stem, in which, probably, nuthatches roost. An empty coconut was, therefore, provided. With birdish distrust and caution, Zoe only eyed it for some days, then perched on it, but finally she went in, and it was amusing to see her evident delight. How she went incessantly in and out, and turned round and round inside, and finally sat down and remained in it for an hour or more, quite still and happy, peering out at anyone passing by, her sleek head and neck looking remarkably like a snake, and her furtive black eye observantly watching all that went on around her. Her cage, when not in the conservatory, was placed on a table in the drawing-room, close to where I was sitting, and thus she was frequently spoken to and noticed, which is one great secret in taming birds and animals. They soon learn to greet one with some token of recognition, and their often solitary lives are brightened and cheered by such companionship. An amusing thing occurred one day while I was away from home for a few hours. Zoe's cage had been placed in the sun, and a friend of mine, glancing at the bird, saw her in an apparently dying state, her head hanging on one side, the beak wide open, all the feathers ruffled, and the whole aspect of the bird indicating the near approach of death. The bell was rung, the servants came in, and whispered consultations were held as to what could be done, and what would mistress say seemed the uppermost thought. All at once, Zoe jumped down and began a vigorous hammering at her tree stem, as full of life as ever, and she was at once voted a little impostor. When I returned and heard the account, it was easy to explain that my birdie had been enjoying a sunbath, which always gives rise to most lackadaisical positions while the state of dreamy absorption lasts. The mealworms which Zoe mainly lived upon were kept in a tin biscuit box, which she knew well by sight, and one day, being too busy to spare time to feed her with them, I opened her cage door and put the box down a little way from the cage on the floor, and placed a small log of wood for her to descend by. Down she came, perched on the edge of the box, looked at the layers of flannel which covered her delightful worms, and tugged at one corner after another till she obtained her prey. After swallowing 2 or 3, she thought a little store might be useful, and began taking them in her beak and searching for some convenient hiding places. But as I did not desire to have the drawing-room neatly ornamented with mealworms, I had to prevent that little design being carried out. My tiny pet lived happily for about a year, but when the molting time came she grew weak and ill, and did not seem to have the strength to produce her new plumage. For, in spite of all possible care, she drooped and died. She lives in my memory as one of the most gentle, innocent birdies I have ever had, absolutely without temper, contented and cheerful, a perfect pattern of industry, chipping out holes in her log of wood and flitting about with a happy little chirp from morning till night, a bright example of what a cheery life may be lived, even by a caged bird, when kindly treated and cared for thoughtfully. Blanche the Pigeon. Pigeons possess a great deal more individuality of character than anyone would suppose who has only seen them in flocks picking up grain in a farmyard like domestic fowls. They show to better advantage when only a few pairs are kept and fed daily at some settled place, but to make really interesting pets 2 are quite sufficient, and may be made very amusing companions. Some species may possess more mental capacity than others. Those I have to speak of were snow-white trumpeters. A pair was sent to me, but to my sorrow I found on opening the basket that the male bird had escaped on the way, so I could only put the solitary hen in a cage, and do all that was possible in the way of plentiful food and kind care to make her happy, but all to no purpose. The poor bird pined and grew weaker every day till she became unable to get up on her perch. I used therefore to go to her every evening and place her comfortably for the night, and she soon grew tame enough to like being caressed and talked to, When spring returned, I obtained a male pigeon and hoped Blanche would accept him for a mate, but she showed a great deal of temper and made him so unhappy that he had to be exchanged for another. A fine snow-white bird like herself, and happily of such a forbearing disposition as to endure being considerably henpecked. Now began the curious part of Blanche's history. The pair built a nest in a small pigeon house close to my window, so that I was able to watch all the family arrangements with much interest. Blanche liked to be with me for some hours in the morning, sitting on the table pluming herself, quite at ease, and when that operation was ended, she generally seated herself on a large Bible which lay at one end of the dining table, and there she usually went to sleep. A white dove resting on the Word suggested to one's mind many a beautiful emblematic thought. These visits to me were paid most regularly when a nest was finished and the eggs were being hatched. She then shared the duties of incubation by turns with her mate. He would sit patiently for 4 hours on the nest, while Blanche spent that time with me. Then, punctually at the right moment, she would wake up and, lazily stretching her wings, would fly out at the open window to see how affairs were getting on at home, and take her place on the nest for her appointed 4 hours. She was a most eccentric bird in the matter of laying eggs. I sometimes found she had made me a present of one neatly placed amongst my working materials. In fact, wherever she happened to be upon the table would be deemed by her a suitable place for laying. And as I always conveyed the eggs to her nest, her little freaks did not much matter. But at last she took it into her wilful little head to lay her eggs in the coal scoop, an arrangement which by no means improved her snowy plumage. She had a pretty crest, which curved over her head, and her feet were clothed with rather long feathers reaching to the claws. At our breakfast time she would often sit close to my plate, letting me stroke her and draw out her pretty wings. I must own she was as conceited as any peacock, throwing herself on her side and stretching out a feathered foot, little dreaming how she was being laughed at for her affected attitudes. If she had a fault, it was her temper. I have seen her go up to her mate and give him a most uncalled-for peck, and he, amiable bird, would bear all her unkindness so meekly, only answering by a propitiatory coo. Blanche reared many sons and daughters, but none were so interesting as herself. I ascribe her unusual tameness to the loving care bestowed upon her in her long illness. When once a bird's affections are won in that way, they generally remain firm friends for life. Gerbils. These curious little animals were brought to my notice by a scientific friend who had seen them at the Zoological Gardens, and heard that they were to be obtained there by applying to Mr. Bartlett. As I always regretted the untimely death of my pet jerboa, I thought these little rodents would fill his place and prove amusing pets. And accordingly I paid a visit to the zoo, and found a whole colony of gerbils of all ages living very amicably together in a large, strongly built wooden box, with bran, oats, and nuts for provender. It was no easy matter to secure a pair of suitable size and age. I could but admire the patience of the attendant who made persevering attempts to catch the nimble creatures for me, but they leaped and sprang about, darted through his fingers, disappeared into holes, and seemed to enjoy his discomfiture. At length, a lively pair, with sleek skins and perfect tails, were securely caged. Then I was warned to keep them in a tin-lined cage, as they would gnaw through anything. Even the solid teak chest in which they were kept was being rapidly demolished by their powerful incisors. The gerbils were placed in a plant case 4 feet long, with glass sides and top, through which their gambols could easily be seen. The case had a glass partition, and on one side lived a pair of chipmunks, or striped American squirrels. They were highly incensed at their new neighbors, springing with all their force against the partition with low growlings, casting up the cocoa fiber with their hind legs, as if to try and hide them from their view. They soon found a little chink, through which, I'm afraid, some very strong language was launched at the newcomers. Happily, the gerbils did not mind. They found delightful tree roots to gnaw at, plenty of food, and freedom to frisk and frolic to their heart's content. So their neighbors were free to growl as much as they liked, and they, in their turn, raised a hill of fiber and played at hide-and-seek in their new domain. But let me now describe these gerbils. I believe there are several species, differing somewhat in appearance. These were fawn-colored, with sleek, soft fur, which, like the chinchilla, was bluish next to the skin. They were about the size of small rats, with little ears and long tails, with a black tuft at the end. The fur was white underneath, the eyes jet black and very large, and long black whiskers which were always in motion. The hind legs being longer than the front ones enabled the creature to spring and leap along the ground with great rapidity, as I found to my cost one night when 5 of them got out of their case and gave us an hour's occupation before they could be recaptured. One managed to get inside an American organ and effectually baffled all our efforts to secure him. There was no help for it, he had to be left there, and I went away with an anxious mind as to what his busy teeth would be employed upon all night, and sure enough, next morning a velvet curtain was found nibbled and tattered, and being converted into a nest for the enterprising gerbil. They became very amusing, tame little creatures, ready to take dandelions, nuts, or any little dainty from one's hand. As they breed very readily in England, I was soon presented with a little family of 5 very tiny, pinkish-colored infants, quite blind and destitute of hair. They were not attractive, and so were left to their mother's care till they could see and were properly clothed. And then they were extremely pretty, and rapidly developed all the habits and manners of their parents, gnawing wood, nibbling nuts, and having merry games of their own, darting with wonderful quickness in and out of the tree roots, and getting up small battles for some coveted morsel of diet. The first pair were quiet enough and agreed happily together, but when, later on, mother and daughter happened to have a little brood at the same time, things became complicated, and it was no uncommon sight to see the 2 mothers careering about, each with an infant in its mouth, and it often fell to my lot to take care of the unfortunate children and replace them in the nest, whilst the mothers had a stand-up fight. And this is a literally true expression, for gerbils sit bolt upright and fight each other with their front feet. But though they appear to be in desperate conflict, I must say I never saw that any damage was done. As to their gnawing power, it is almost beyond description. I gave them a strong wooden box as a nursery for the young gerbils, but before long they had eaten out the back and sides, and a mere skeleton of a box remained. There was a piece of zinc which formed a partition, but they ate a hole right through the zinc in no time, and when a wire cage with a sliding door was placed in the plant case, they soon learnt how to lift up the door and get out. We often watched the formation of the family nest, which was constructed of wool and hay nibbled very small, and carried by mouthfuls and woven together. It generally had 2 outlets for ingress and egress. There the entire family would sleep during the day amicably enough, but towards evening the nursery disputes would begin, and old animosities led to frequent battles and scrimmages, because somebody wanted someone else's pieces of wool for the precious infants. Still they were very tame, amusing little creatures, liking to be stroked and fed and rewarded by a run upon the breakfast table, where they would examine every dish and plate in a delicate, inquiring way, not touching the contents, only trying to add to their small amount of knowledge of the outside world. Their food consisted of bran, oats, peanuts, wheat, fresh dandelion, and clover leaves, and on these they lived in perfect health and beauty. As the colony increased, it was needful to make several homes for the gerbils, and the original pair happened to be, for a time, in a cage upstairs on a landing. One of these found its way out of the cage, down the stairs, across the hall, and was discovered next morning in a room where the younger members of the family were kept. This would go to prove a keen scent which, I suppose, guided the little animal to find its friends, and also confirms what travelers have written about gerbils living in large colonies and always keeping together. One evening I had to read some natural history papers at a Band of Mercy meeting in a neighboring village, where the clergyman's wife took great interest in promoting kindness to animals, and as I proposed speaking about the gerbils, I thought I would take some of them with me to show the children. Accordingly, a mother and 4 little ones were put into a cage with some food and bedding for their comfort whilst being exhibited. I was scarcely prepared for the tremendous sensation the gerbils created.
"Oi, here's a lot of mice. Nah, they ain't, they's rats. Will they bite?"
And then such a cluster of children came round me they had to be called to order, and the cage was carried round that all might see the little foreigners, and through all the after proceedings many pairs of eyes remained fixed upon the cage and its inmates. I fancy that evening will long be remembered by the children. The great difficulty that attends the keeping of these little animals is their rapid rate of increase. It is true they can all be kept together, for, as I have said, though there are squabbles, they do not result in any personal injury, and thus my colony was allowed to go on till there was no counting the number of generations that existed. I very much wished to reduce the numbers, and gave some away, but could never tell which were the mothers of the small pink infants I was being presented with continually. I tried putting a little family of the babies into a cage in the plant case, hoping the mother who belonged to them would then appear and take care of them. But no, the entire colony trooped in and ran riot in the new place, and if a young gerbil was by chance left uncovered in the melee, a 20th cousin would take it up tenderly as if it was its own mother and replace it in the nest, a very emblem of brotherly kindness and charity. The colony had finally to be dispersed and given away in small detachments to different friends. Water shrews. Hearing that the little patients in a London hospital had scarcely any toys, and that they especially desired a very large doll, I had one dressed for them, and various other interesting items, such as an album of pictures, bags of shells, a stamp snake, etc., were prepared. But a large box was needed in which to pack all these treasures, and one which had been for months in the wine cellar was brought up for that purpose into the hall. It was filled with straw, and as I was watching this being taken out, I noticed some small black animals darting about in it. "They must be young rats," I exclaimed, "and the rare kind, too, the black rat, which has been almost entirely eradicated by the stronger brown species. A curious instance, by the way, of a foreign interloper driving out the native." I immediately resolved to secure these animals, whatever they might prove to be, and armed with leather gloves and an empty glass globe to place my captures in, I began to search in the straw and soon secured the supposed rats. But they proved to be a pair of water shrews, jet black, lively little creatures, with sharply pointed snouts and teeth, as I soon discovered to my cost. I had taken off my gloves and was watching the activity of the shrews, when suddenly they flew upon each other, biting and screaming with rage, and thinking they would kill each other at that rate, I tried to separate them, but one turned and bit me pretty severely, and it was with some difficulty they were parted. One I put into a zinc fern case, and the other into a large empty aquarium with shingle at the bottom, moss and wool for bedding, and a large pan of water for swimming and bathing. They were rather larger than the common mouse, jet black above and grayish-white beneath, restless, active creatures usually found near ponds and ditches. And however these two had found their way into a dry cellar and lived in a box of straw will always remain a mystery. I learnt from books that they fed on worms and insects, and that diet was provided, though much to my distress, for it is a miserable thing to see any living creature tortured and devoured alive, even though it may be in obedience to natural instincts. Happily, I soon found a substitute. I was showing one of the shrews to a fellow student of natural history, and with a long feather soon attracted the little animal's attention. He always came out of his bed and sprang upon the feather like a little tiger, dragging it about and holding on with the grip of a bulldog, so that one could lift him off the ground and keep him swinging a minute in the air to see the pretty white fur underneath. My friend suggested that it probably fed on small birds and thought the feather was part of its daily fare. I obtained a fowl's head from the larder, and then it was a sight to see how it was pounced upon and dragged about until securely hidden under the moss, when we could hear our little friend crunching the bones and tearing it to pieces as if he had not had anything so good for a long while. One shrew died in a few days, but the other lived 3 weeks in perfect health, and I believe it was an accidental failure of sufficient food that led to the death of the second. Their appetite seems to be, like that of the mole, most voracious, and unless they obtain a constant and ample supply of food, they quickly die of hunger. They are worth studying for a few days, but their dreadful odor and fierce character make them anything but pets. I suppose there is hardly any animal in England so fierce and combative, and probably that may account for the fact that one so often comes across a dead shrew lying on the path in summer. When swimming, the shrew's furry coat perfectly resisted the entrance of moisture. It always came out absolutely dry. The said coat was most carefully kept in order. A daily brushing and cleansing went on. The little tongue was often at work licking off every little speck of dust, The toes were spread out and examined, the small amount of tail kept in order. I could but think how many a lesson we may learn from the small as well as the great creations of God's hand. Habits such as this little animal possessed might, in the way of cleanliness, lead to the prevention of endless diseases, if imitated by those who never dream of daily cleansings as being necessary to health and life. Stay tuned for the next segment from Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.